Joining me today is Bud Jackson, founder of Jackson Group Media and a principal at Aurora Strategy. Good to have you on, Bud.
Hey, thanks. Great to be here, Marcel. Good morning.
So a lot of things have been happening in Washington and the U.S. on the political scene. First of all, we had the FBI raid take place at Mar-a-Lago. A lot of people have been jumping up and down about that, both pro-Trump and pro-Democrats. What's your take on this?
Well, it's in the eye of the beholder right now. We're still waiting for more information, I think. A report just came out this morning from the Washington Post, and some of the materials that they were looking for were related to nuclear weapons, and that could mean anything. So, and Trump also said this morning that he was okay with releasing the actual warrant. So we need to learn more about this. But I think in general, it probably tilts back to beauty is in the eye of the beholder in terms of how this is going to impact the race. The Republicans are going to say this is riling up their base, it's getting people angry, and it's going to get them to go support Trump. Democrats on the other side my view is that the more the general electorate or general election voters focus on issues like this, the Republicans are talking about these sorts of issues rather than focusing on the economy, gas prices, et cetera, then it actually helps Democrats, because hopefully we are now in a lane where we're just going to focus in on things like that.
Well, it's been a pretty good week or two for President Biden. He scored a major victory in Congress, getting his bills passed that were logjammed for almost a year or so. How is that going to play out for Democrats in the upcoming midterm elections?
So let's talk about the midterm elections and historically and what we're looking at right now. On the agenda here in the U.S. are, all the House seats are in play, and then there are 35 seats in the Senate at play. Of the 35 seats in the Senate at play, 21 have to be defended by Republicans, 14 are being defended by Democrats. For control, obviously there's an even 50-50 split in the Senate, so a one seat flip to the Republicans gives them a majority and helps stymie anything the Biden administration wants to do for the next couple of years. So let's talk about control for the Senate first.
Sure.
I'm an optimist, and our best chances as a Democrat are in the Senate. Our best chances of securing a majority in the Senate, securing a majority in either of these houses is going to be in the Senate, as opposed to the House, which is likely going to go Republican. But on the Senate side, Democrats are benefiting from a primary election where Donald Trump-backed incumbents did very well. And what does that mean for the general election? Donald Trump-backed candidates are some of the more extreme candidates in the Republican Party, and as a result,
well, aren't these the same type of people who've been denying that the election was lost? They're the same people who support the January 6th insurrection?
Exactly. This is the more fringy side of the Republican Party. Again, I put air quotes on Republican Party because the Republican Party isn't what it used to be. It's not a conservative, sort of anti-tax conservative party. Now it's sort of
It's not the same party as the Bush administrations.
And when we're in the Bush administration, we're saying it wasn't the same as the Reagan, but this is basically an extreme fringe sliver of the Republican Party. It represents Donald Trump's, hardcore 33 to 35% of support. But going back to the point here, the fringe versus the Democratic candidates, Republicans had the option of nominating a more moderate, even that should be in air quotes, honestly, a more moderate version of a Republican candidate to take on the Democrat in November, but they chose not to because Trump is winning these, showing that he is still strong within the Republican Party in terms of his sway. But as a result, you've got in some of these key battleground states, you actually have weaker Republican candidates against the Democrats.
Well, there were stories, sorry, Bud, but there were stories that Democrats were encouraging Democratic voters to vote in the primaries for some of these right-wing Republicans.
Yes, Democratic candidates, special interest groups made a obvious effort to support the fringe Republican candidates to try to help them to get nominated, because they knew they had a better chance in November of beating these people even against all the headwinds that face Democrats. And we've seen that play out to the Democrats' advantage in states like Pennsylvania, where we have Dr. Oz, a reality TV show doctor, now facing the Democratic nominee, which is helping Democrats there right now. They have a lead in Pennsylvania, which is one of the important swing states. You're seeing that in Georgia, where former NFL player Herschel Walker, who has been saying crazy things, has been nominated for the Republicans. So a weaker Republican opponent in many of these important, crucial states are bolstering Democratic chances for at least hanging on to the majority of the Senate. Okay, so now let's talk about the House. On the House side, it's a totally different story. You start off with a baseline of historical precedent. You can go all the way back to World War II, and only 2 instances since then has a president's party gained seats during the off-election year, and those were anomalies. 2002, George W. Bush picked up some seats. That's because his popularity was at over 60% following September 11, 2001 attacks. People were rallying around the flag. And then you'd have to go back to, I think it was 98, where Clinton was going through, the Monica Lewinsky affair, and it became highly partisan. And since then, even that, I wouldn't even look at that as a good example, because since then we've had redistricting that has significantly favored Republicans. And then if you look at it in even a macro sense, any president that has had a popularity of like 45% or as low as 40%, which is Biden's territory, it's not only a loss of seat for that party, but it's significant. I think Barack Obama lost 45 seats, and his popularity at the time was around 45%. And right now, Biden is at 40 to 43%. So the headwinds looking into onto the House side say, there's no way we're going to regain the majority. There's only a 4-seat, 12, yeah, 4-seat difference in the House. So right now the general consensus is that Democrats are, I'd say, even odds in the Senate to maintain the majority. I might give them a slight edge of a few points. On the House side, given historical conditions, given Biden's popularity, it just seems like a huge mountain to overcome. Now, having said all of that, anyone that's going to prognosticate with absolute certainty on either the House side or the Senate side, even based on historical conditions, is nuts. Because everything that has been happening here in the U.S. lately is crazy, and it's throwing sort of mechanisms into the engine that could just blow things up, and in a positive way potentially. 1 month ago, I would say that both the Senate and the House are probably going to be gone. We're fighting Democrats in part because of Biden, and in large part because of the economy writ large and what's happening internationally. They're just setting things up in such a poor way for Democrats that it would be impossible to overcome. The Democrats weren't accomplishing anything on their agenda. Senator Joe Manchin and Senator Sinema were, basically creating a roadblock for any progress or anything getting passed with anything meaningful. The war in Ukraine has increased prices on gasoline here immensely, and then inflation has been rising. But in the last month, what are we seeing? We're seeing all of a sudden Manchin and Sinema have changed. They've helped given the Biden administration some legislative victories. The former Build Back Better has now been pared down and has been called the Inflation Reduction Act. Within that, there are many positive things that the Democrats can go out and actually campaign on that are issues, pocketbook issues, and they can show that they're actually making progress, and contrast that with the Republicans who are still focused on, saying that the elections weren't real or weren't truthful in their results, and they can, complain that the Department of Justice is unfairly targeting Donald Trump, and they're all going to get distracted. And then gasoline is now ebbing, which is helping down here. It just recently went underneath $4. And inflation has started to turn. We're getting reports now that in June it just started to turn the corner. So a month is a lifetime in politics, and we're only in August. So if the economy continues to improve and Democrats can get out there and start talking about their agenda in a positive way, I don't think we'll I don't think it's possible for us to keep the House, but we might stem the losses at least, and it will help us for the future.
So who are going to be the key Democrats that are going to be out there? Is the president going to be campaigning actively? Does he have enough coattails to help pull some Democratic candidates across the finish line? Or is it going to require some other people? Is Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi? Are they going to be out there stumping? Are they going to be able to help Democratic candidates? Who in the Democratic side of the ledger is going to be able to help bring candidates across the finish line?
I think this year, as in past cycles, how you use presidents and other prominent sort of Democratic or Republican leaders for that is done more in a tactical way. Biden might be used in GOTV efforts in the last week in areas where having him come and visit might help boost turnout. He'll also be used, hopefully, to help raise some money for some of these candidates and draw attention to them. There are very few districts, I surmise, outside of California and New York, where you're going to want Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer coming in for a huge publicity tour, but you might have them in to do a quiet fundraiser among Democratic prominent fundraisers where it might make a difference. So they'll be tactically used, but I wouldn't see them doing a barnstorm tour. The Pelosi, Schumer, and Biden tour is unlikely to happen.
Let's talk about something that's been a trend in American politics for a number of years, and that is dark money and third-party money that's gone into campaigns. We've seen tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in third-party advertising to take down the president or to promote right-wing causes. How do you think that's going to impact in this election?
Well, I think what we're seeing is more of the same, honestly, now that this has all become, the rules of the road. It's not an anomaly anymore or a new sort of sensation sweeping politics. It's pretty common now. It's happening on both sides, and it's something that campaigns are more attuned with now. We're always tracking what's being spent on the outside. If you're a campaign, you're always tracking what's happening on the outside of your control. As a result, there is record spending, at least on television that I track closely, and digital in some of these races. And I think we're already on course for this off year to have record spending down here on these sorts of things. With outside groups and campaigns, it's always sort of the law of surprises and unintended consequences. You don't know what these outside groups are going to do, and they can both hurt you and help you. They can theoretically be there to help you, but still end up hurting you anyway. So they will continue to have an influence and can help set the agenda both in a good way and a bad way in some of these races.
I want to just shift slightly to talk about the January 6th hearings and what impact those are going to have in the midterm. Do you see anything significant coming out of that? Obviously, one of the things that we're going to be watching is what's happening in Wyoming, where the current vice chair of the committee is up for re-election, and she's going to be facing a tough Republican challenger in the primaries, and most likely people are saying that she's not going to win.
Yeah, the impact on the midterms, I think the average voter down here is more focused on the economy and what's happening with their own pocketbook and what the gas prices are than they are on some of those things. Liz Cheney, who used to be sort of one of the Darth Vaders of Democrats in Democrats' eyes, is suddenly the more moderate voice and somewhat a hero. So I would say the January 6th committee is part of the noise, just politically speaking, not literally speaking. They're part of the noise on the Republican sides that might help Republicans to raise money, might help Democrats to raise money, might impact or be used as a tool in terms of using them for turnout. But what's happening with the January 6th committee, really goes beyond politics. It's a matter of history. It's a matter of making sure that everything that happened on that day comes out into light and is documented for history, so we all know what's going on. So I think it's probably going to be a wash in terms of its political impact on the elections, but I think it is important historically.
So besides Liz Cheney and Wyoming, what other ridings or what other districts should we be keeping an eye on in terms of how things are playing out? You mentioned earlier Pennsylvania, with Oz in Pennsylvania and a couple of others. So what are your ones?
Let's start on the House side. There's here in the U.S., every 2 years, all 435 seats are up for election. But the reality is, in this election, there's probably 20 to 30 different House districts that are potentially, in play, and then there's probably another 10 to 15 more that are on the fringe and can go. It depends on turnout and what happens in the final weeks. So what you're really focusing in on, if you want to go down to a granular level on a seat by seat, is over on the Senate side, and there you're talking states like Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, Arizona, which is incumbent Mark Kelly, Wisconsin, and Mark Kelly is a Democrat, sorry. Wisconsin, right. Republican Ron Johnson. Democrats feel like they have a chance to take him out, and he's vulnerable. Ohio is in play. And then, of course, Georgia with Senator Raphael Warnock being challenged by Herschel Walker. Right. So those are sort of the biggies. Yeah. Republicans have long had an advantage on the state legislative level, where a lot of these states determine their boundaries for redistricting. There are some states that have already shifted to, are starting to shift to, a more independent approach to establishing congressional lines and state legislative lines. So yes, the statewide races are important. Democrats seem to be doing pretty well on the governorship level, at least right now, because of a similar effect of Republicans in the Trump effect of nominating the more extreme people. Pennsylvania, again, is another key state that I happen to be focused on more than some of the others. In that state, there's a huge Trump guy named Mastriano, who I believe was at January 6th, at the Capitol of January 6th, or at least in D.C. during January 6th, and he's running against the state's attorney general nominee, which is Josh Shapiro. And Democrats have a lead in that race right now, probably because Republicans nominated Mastriano. And that is a good example of a state where the Democratic campaign, Josh Shapiro's campaign, spent money trying to help Mastriano get elected on the Republican primary, so that could be the candidate he's faced. So that's another good example of Democrats actually picking what they wished for. So hopefully they'll be able to actually achieve a win based on what they've done, or in part on what they've done. So I haven't gone down to the granular level on the state legislative races in each of these states, but there are several states that are huge and probably correlate with some of these swing districts. Like in Pennsylvania, I think House Democrats on the state legislative level have a 12-seat majority, but they got redistricted years ago and are wildly benefited Republicans in Pennsylvania. So it's hard to win back these seats, and that phenomena is happening in a lot of these different sort of battleground states.
Well, I think one of the states also that people are watching is what's happening with Texas with Beto O'Rourke.
Redistricting down in Texas and the southern states, especially when they did redistricting, it was done to bolster Republicans. and their chances, and to keep seats in the House and the federal House, the U.S. House of Representatives, and down there. Democrats had thought that they were going to offset some of the seats that Republicans were picking up through this redistricting game down there in New York, believe it or not. And the lines in New York, I believe, last I heard, were rejected and now have to be redone again more independently, which means that Republicans are going to be able to lock in some seat gains they're making down south, and Democrats aren't able to make up for it up in New York. And going back 10 years now, the Republicans have been very obvious in their efforts to lock down redistricting down in the South to make sure they always have, at least over 150 congressional seats, probably unwinnable by Democrats throughout the South. So they have a block of support down there that can't be penetrated, which means now you have to go elsewhere to try to win a majority. And then, you've got swing districts that were swing districts that, might be trending in the wrong direction for Democrats if Latino voters, for example, start to creep towards more Republican support than they have in years past. And we've started to sort of see the sand start to move in that direction a little bit. So it's another...
Well, we saw that in Florida with Trump winning over Latinos over Biden.
Yeah, yes. Although it's also important to caution that not all Latino voters are the same, and Latino voters in Florida are a lot different than in other states. And you also have, Cuban people down in southern portion of Florida. That's a whole nother ball of wax down there. So you have to be a little bit careful and segregate out these Latino voters. They're not all Latinos are alike. Democrats need to. That's actually an important point for Democrats. Democrats have treated Latino voters very similar for a long time, and they need to be a little bit more. They need to do a better job on their messaging to Latino voters, and not just treat them as a monolithic bloc that doesn't care about things that everyone else cares about, like the economy and gas prices, for example.
Right. But American politics is truly fascinating, and love to have you back in another podcast to update us and share with us your points of view. For now, I'd like to thank you for joining us. It's Bud Jackson, founder of Jackson Group Media. Look forward to having you back again.
Thanks. Take care.
Joining me today are Thomas Borwick, who's the director of the College Green Group based in London, England, and is a conservative strategist, and Rick Perkins, Member of Parliament for South Shore, St. Margaret's. Good to have both of you on the show today. Thank you. Well, both Rick and Thomas, several things that you have in common. You're both conservatives, one Canadian, one British, but both parties are actually undergoing leadership campaigns. Boris Johnson, who resigned as Prime Minister and head of the UK Conservative Party, and in Canada, Erin O'Toole resigned as a Conservative leader, and there's an active campaign that's going to conclude in a few weeks that applies to both. So, how did we get there? Thomas, how did the Conservatives dump Boris Johnson?
I suppose it was death by 1,000 cuts. There were a series of small issues over the last few years. There's been some inconsistencies over the COVID legislation and process. Boris Johnson believes in redemption. Boris Johnson very much believed in promoting those people that may have done wrong in the past, but had the opportunity for forgiveness and working with them. Some of those people have let themselves down and the party down. There's a variety of different reasons there was discontent between the seats facing the Liberal Democrats in the South and those facing Labour in the North. It was clear that a populist Prime Minister was always going to have a problem after COVID, and people wanted to work out financially both how we pay, but how the dividends and prosperity could be divided. levelling up has been a great agenda item for the Conservative Party, but it hasn't had the output as fast and as quickly as people wanted. That impatience and that concern that Boris Johnson was not going to win the next general election has meant that he's been replaced and a leadership election has been triggered. As part of that process, there was a vote of no confidence. That vote of no confidence was actually won by Boris Johnson, but further conversations occurred, and unfortunately, as a result of those, he then resigned. This is not a universally popular opinion, and about 40% of party members say on recent polls that they'd be happy to have him back as Prime Minister.
Well, he did deliver one of the largest Conservative victories in the last election in the UK.
Absolutely, he has been a fantastic electoral asset. But one of the most astonishing things about the Conservative Party is their ability to do regicide. The number of leaders that we have got rid of is astonishing, but that has given a longevity to the Conservative Party. After all, it's been 11 years in government in the same broad stripes of Conservatives. Particularly if you go back in time, we have many very successful and perhaps unsuccessful prime ministers or leaders of the Conservative Party that have been got rid of by the 1922 committee.
And contrast that in Canada, Rick, with what Thomas just shared with us. The Conservatives have been out of power for a number of years now. They've had 3 new leaders in 3 elections, all of which they've lost. And now they're going to elect a new leader. How does this square with how Conservatives feel?
Yeah, well, it's a good summary of our situation, Marcel. Of course, one of those 3 leaders was former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, who was nearing the end of his 10-year term when he faced re-election, an attempt to another re-election in 2015, and it's very difficult for a lot of governments, at least in our country, to survive past 10 years. The party ran a pretty poor campaign in 2015, and Justin Trudeau, with his sunny ways and woke politics, ruled the day. You know, basically people were tired of Stephen Harper. In 2019, where I was a candidate, an unsuccessful candidate for Parliament, we had a new leader, Andrew Scheer, who was fairly young and made a number of missteps during that campaign, from questions about his resume to his handling of social conservative issues. And there was just a lack of trust at the door with him. So while we managed to reduce Justin Trudeau's majority to a minority, the party was pretty unhappy with the fact that Andrew wasn't able to win, and didn't think he had a possibility for staying power. In that case, it was really pressure from the caucus and pressure from the party, and no formal process that led Andrew to step down. We faced another leadership, and Erin O'Toole, a caucus member, won. He faced an election in 2021. Which again I ran and was successful in my riding, but we actually lost 2 seats, even though we won the popular vote. We got more votes than the Liberal Party. Liberal Party won a minority government. There was a lot of angst within the caucus and the party, and we had a power that is available to all the parties in Canada, but only the Conservative Party takes advantage of. The caucus chose to exercise its right under an act of Parliament to hold a vote of non-confidence in the leader, and Erin was not successful, did not survive that vote in January, which launched us into the leadership campaign that we're in now. There are already rumors, as you know, Marcel, of an election perhaps as early as this fall. I doubt we'll see that, but with Liberals, if the polls look good for them, they'll pull the plug if that's to their advantage. So our leadership is over on September 10th. So our process is a little different than the British process. We have a one member, one vote system, which I personally don't like, where a $15 membership allows you to vote in the leadership. We have a record membership of any political party in Canada. We've risen we had about 275,000 members in the last leadership 2 years ago. We now have almost 700,000 members of the party, which speaks to the main two challengers and their popularity, but it also speaks to, I think, a real shift in the public and disappointment and anger with the current government. Many people around the world saw the trucker convoy here in Canada in February, a very large populist movement that developed as a result of frustration with government policy over COVID. And that's also contributed to where we are today.
So let me ask Thomas, how do the UK Conservatives elect their leader? We just heard from Rick saying that it's a one member, one vote system. They have a slightly different way of doing it. And Rick, I'm going to try and concisely explain, is that each riding is given 100 points, and depending on the number of votes cast for a candidate, they get a percentage of that 100 points. And then the number of points overall across the country, that's more than 50% plus one, becomes the next leader. So Thomas, how does the UK Conservatives elect their leader?
You seem to have a fantastically exciting process in Canada, and congratulations to those that make such a process work. So we have a very simple process. The Conservative Party had elections, give or take, every Tuesday and Thursday within the members of Parliament. Their responsibility is to get the list down to 2 people. Those 2 people are then given to the wider Conservative Party electorate, about 175,000 members, give or take. That process is, for this year, for the first time, being done on an online ballot. It's clear that GCHQ and other entities have raised concerns about this ballot, but we are hopeful, for the sake of the Conservative Party, that it is a sensible ballot. The end of voting is September the 3rd, with September the 5th being the date that the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom will be announced. At the moment, most of the polls are favouring Liz Truss, but it's entirely possible that Rishi Sunak wins at this stage.
Mm-hmm. So really quite a different method between Canada and the UK. Let's talk a little bit about the candidates and the seemingly shift to the right, at least in Canada. The last 2 leaders, Scheer and O'Toole, both projected themselves as more on the right-wing side. The leading contender for the Conservatives in this campaign is Pierre Poilievre, who's a more populist, further to the right candidate. In the UK, we have Johnson, who portrayed himself as a bit of a populist. And then now we have the Truss and Sunak are the 2 candidates. I'd like to get both of your opinions on where you think things are shaping out.
Well, in terms of Canada, I just say I really like the British system. I actually had many conversations with former leader William Hague back when he was leader of the British Tory Party, and they reformed the constitution to that method. I think it gives members of Parliament a significant role. This is the first time in modern Canadian history where the caucus, in our case, the caucus actually had a confidence vote in the leader. Generally, it's party and convention. So,
and it should be pointed out, Rick, that came under Stephen Harper's administration.
Yeah, it was a result of the merger of the 2 Conservative parties that had split from the Mulroney days into 2 parties. When they came back together, that method of electing was part of the negotiation between the 2 parties. So in terms of the candidates, we had 6, we've got 5 that are going to the membership. The 2 front runners are former Premier of Quebec, Jean Charest, who is also a former leader of our party from one of our predecessor parties in the 1990s. He was the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada, and he was a minister under the Brian Mulroney days as well, and deputy prime minister at one point. And Pierre Poilievre, who is been in Parliament for 17 years, is in his early 40s. You're right, Marcel. Many call Pierre a populist. Pierre is a bit more of a libertarian, I think, than he is a populist. He believes, obviously, that there isn't much that government does, that it does well. And so less government is usually a better. Jean Charest is more of a progressive conservative in the style of very progressive on social issues, but a fiscal conservative. So we have two contrasting styles. They're both very effective public speakers and politicians. Pierre has tapped into the angst of COVID that you saw in the Freedom Convoy. In fact, freedom and making Canada the freest country in the world is basically the slogan of his leadership campaign. And he is the odds-on favorite. We really don't know, because at the end of the day, it depends how many of the 675,000 people actually mail in their ballots. And as you said, Marcel, in what proportion and what riding do they mail them in? Jean Charest is very strong in Quebec and Atlantic Canada and doing well in the urban areas. And Pierre Poilievre is dominant in the prairies in Western Canada and doing well in Ontario too. And to be fair, outside of Quebec, Pierre has support in pretty much every other riding.
Mm-hmm. Thomas, can you give us a quick rundown of the two candidates for the UK Conservative leadership?
Yeah, so both are trying to position themselves as not incumbents, whereas looking at their past history, it's both clear that they've been presiding over the current problems and current crisis. It's hard to argue that Boris Johnson was particularly right-leaning, given the huge amount of state intervention we had in the COVID period. We have Rishi Sunak arguing for tax increases, the planned national insurance, and the projections with currently corporate taxes. We have Liz Truss saying that actually the way to beat inflation is lower taxes. Now, neither are going to roll back the state. Both have tried to argue for reviews of the EU legislation agenda, looking at the plan to export illegal immigrants to Rwanda. Both are in favour of that, but both are also committing to net zero on the current stated objectives. So we're not seeing a lurch for the right or left. It's probably quite a similar agenda to what we've had with the more recent Conservative Party, and that might give cause for concern by many of the right wing of the Conservative Party, that we have seen an irrevocable shift to the middle. Whether or not that is electorally good or bad is certainly to be considered, and something we probably won't know till May 2024, the likely next date of the general election.
Mm-hmm. Well, both leadership races will conclude in early September. September 5th, if I'm correct, Thomas, for the UK, and September 10th for the Canadian Conservatives. And so I'd like to invite both of you back to discuss who the winner is and what that means for each of your respective parties. I want to thank Rick Perkins, the Member of Parliament for South Shore St. Margaret, and Thomas Borwick, who's the Director of College Green Group, for joining me today. Gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thank you, Marcel. Look forward to coming back after September 10th.
I'm joined today with David Weinberg, a columnist with the Jerusalem Post focusing on diplomatic and defense issues. David is also a principal at Aurora Strategy Global. David, so nice for you to join us today.
My honor and pleasure, Marcel.
David can't pick up a newspaper any day of the week without something referring to Israel. Most recently, we saw a 3-day Operation Breaking Dawn that took out a number of Islamic jihadists, terrorists in Gaza, and we saw over 1,000 missiles rain down on Israel as a result of that action. Did Israel accomplish its objectives, and what does the future hold?
Excellent questions. Israel has been forced into 5 rounds of warfare against enemies in the Gaza Strip since the Iranian-backed Hamas and Islamic Jihad factions overthrew the Palestinian Authority and conquered Gaza back in 2007. The latest round of warfare is really a war between wars that Israel constantly seems to need to fight to destroy jihadist weapons storage facilities and training camps. With almost no rest between one operation and the other. And alas, this seems to be Israel's fate. There are so many good things going on in the Middle East. Positive, peaceful relations developing between Israel and Sunni-led states in the region, but on the Palestinian front, we're faced with some ideologically implacable enemies who do not believe in peace with Israel and are encroaching on Israel's both its northern and southern borders. So if you ask me what I foresee in the future, unfortunately, it means more rounds of conflict.
So David, in a recent column that you penned for the Jerusalem Post, you described Israel's actions as mowing the lawn in the past, and that this new Operation Breaking Dawn signals a change in Israeli tactics. What do you mean by that?
Well, Israel must ensure that Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, is not militarized. It needs to demilitarize problem areas such as the Gaza Strip, southern Syria, and the Sinai Desert. And that requires constant military action. It sort of requires endless grit in a war against terrorist armies. Just as Israel has been seeking to rout out Iranian guards placements on its northern border, striking at Iranian weapons shipments to Hezbollah in Lebanon almost on a nightly and certainly on a weekly basis. Much the same is going to be required to deal with these Iranian-backed enemies in the Gaza Strip. It sounds militaristic. It requires a ferocious Israeli positioning. This is the necessary Israeli strategic posture. It's the Israeli reality. It's the only path to true Israeli security and ultimately to a more stable situation. Doesn't sound great, but that's the reality. Everybody should get used to it.
Mm-hmm. Now, the truce between Islamic Jihad and Israel was brokered by Egypt. But what I found interesting was that very few Arab countries spoke out about what was happening. We didn't have anything from Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, or Morocco, or any condemnations that I was able to find of Israel's action. How does that reality play out?
You're absolutely correct. It's an important insight that you just described, and it's because of the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords have transformed the strategic architecture of the Middle East, with Israel moving from a defensive stance against Iran and its proxies to an offensive posture that is buttressed by a network of alliances between Israel and Arab countries. It might even be said that the Abraham Accords have brought about an end to the Arab-Israeli conflict. What remains live and combustible is an Iranian-Israeli conflict with some co-combatants in the Arab world on either side. As a result, Israel is becoming the linchpin of a new regional order, and you see that in the recent conflict, where countries such as Egypt, Jordan, some of the Gulf states, and quietly the Saudis are on Israel's side when it comes to confronting Iranian-backed radical jihadist groups such as Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and that goes also for some Sunni jihadist groups such as Al-Qaeda, the Muslim Brotherhood, and ISIS. As I said, Israel is the center of a new international security order, an emerging alliance structure that reaches from the United States and Europe to North Africa, Saudi Arabia, its Persian Gulf allies, and all the way across to India.
Okay. Let me just conclude with one discussion on the effectiveness of the Iron Dome. As I mentioned earlier, close to 1,000 or over 1,000 missiles rained down on Israel. A number of them, it should be pointed out, actually missed their mark and landed within Gaza. But of those that did penetrate into Israeli space, the Iron Dome appeared to knock down over 95% of those incoming missiles, and there were no casualties and very minimal loss of property as a result of those missiles that did land.
Yes, this is a blessed and an unfortunate reality all at the same time. There is no other country in the world, other than Israel, which has something like 200,000 rockets and missiles aimed at its heartland by enemy actors that straddle its borders. I'm referring primarily to Hezbollah, which has taken over much of Lebanon. That's another Iranian-backed terrorist army. And of course, Hamas and Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip on a smaller scale. Because of that, Israel's been forced to develop a multi-layer, multi-tier, layered missile defense system, actually a number of systems, beginning with systems that handle short-range mortar rockets, to systems such as the Iron Dome air defense system, which handles short-range rockets and missiles, all the way up to the Arrow 2 and David's Sling system, which are aerial defense systems meant to protect Israel against ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and long-range ballistic missiles that the Iranians now possess and are constantly developing and expanding. Blessedly, these systems have provided a incredible air defense umbrella with a 95% success rate in the most recent conflict, sparing Israeli lives. Without these systems, hundreds, if not thousands, of Israelis may have lost their lives, along with enormous devastation in Israel's most populated area, such as the greater Tel Aviv area, had this system not been in place. It's, as I said, it's a sad reality that we need to develop these systems, and we're now sharing them with other countries in the world. But it's an unfortunate reality that our neighbors, our enemies, seem to feel that they can target our civilian populations at will, and we need to develop the systems to protect ourselves as a result.
Mm-hmm. Let me shift to President Biden's recent visit to the Middle East. What did you think that accomplished, if anything? You know, this first visit by the U.S. president to Israel. It should be added that he also visited Saudi Arabia and several other countries on that diplomatic mission. But a lot of the focus was what happened in Israel and also what happened in the West Bank.
Many people here in the region, including Israeli leaders, indeed asked themselves, why did President Biden come to visit at this time? And the best answer that I have, I think it's the answer you'll hear from most analysts in the region, is that he primarily was traveling to Saudi Arabia in order to try to reach a new understanding with Saudi leaders about oil supplies, given the world energy crisis that is a side effect of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And in that regard, it doesn't seem like Biden was too successful. Along the way, he came to Israel. And it was nice that President Biden came to Israel, reiterated America's commitment to Israel's safety and security and prosperity in the most dramatic ways. He signed something called the Jerusalem Declaration, which is an eloquently worded statement that reinforces the parameters of the U.S.-Israel strategic relationship. But there was no substantive innovation there or substantive upgrading. And on the one issue that Israel considers it to be a existential security issue, which is the Iranian nuclear weapons program, Biden brought no new tidings. He still seems hell-bent on reaching a renewed accord with the Iranians along parameters that Israel feels are dangerous and unwise. And in that regard, both Israel and the Gulf states maintain deep differences with the Biden administration. It doesn't seem like Biden's visit has changed much in that regard. So it would be hard for me to declare Biden's visit an important strategic turning point in the region. It was good to see him mending ties with the Saudis and reinforcing his rhetorical and strategic commitments to Israel. But we remain deeply divided over how to handle the Iranian challenge.
Now, there was some controversy in Israel about Biden's visit to East Jerusalem, where he met with Palestinian leadership, and the fact that he specifically declined any participation by any Israeli officials. How do you see that played out?
As presidential visits to this region go, the Palestinian matter was really a non-issue. Biden did make a 3-hour visit to the eastern part of Jerusalem, as you mentioned, and a several-hour visit to the Church of the Nativity and meet Mahmoud Abbas in Bethlehem. And Israel is generally okay with, even supportive of, America extending additional humanitarian and economic aid to the very weak and troubled Palestinian Authority, which Biden did. But the fact that Biden insisted on visiting this Palestinian hospital in eastern Jerusalem without any accompaniment of Israeli officials, and he took the Israeli flag off his limousine when he drove over to the eastern side of Jerusalem, that is troubling to Israel. It's one way of America saying that it doesn't quite recognize the permanency of Israeli sovereignty over a united Jerusalem, even though that is American policy as enunciated by the previous administration, the Trump administration. And even though the U.S. now maintains its embassy to Israel in Israel's capital, Jerusalem, as it should, this was taken here in Israel as somewhat of a slap, somewhat of a sop to the Palestinians, as a way of America saying, we know that you, the Palestinian people, have sovereignty claims in Jerusalem, and we're not insensitive to them. Israel wisely decided not to make too much of an issue. in this regard. As I said, the Biden trip was about the Saudis and the Iranians and long-term American commitments to Israel. Unfortunately, no one expects real progress in Palestinian-Israeli diplomacy in the years to come because the Palestinians themselves have become so divided and so radicalized that they're simply not ready for a real compromise with Israel. And I say that with great regret.
Well, one of the things that we saw as a result of the Biden visit, and you mentioned that he did go to Saudi Arabia, is that Saudi Arabia is now allowing flights over its territory to Israel, and for Israeli flag carriers to fly over Saudi airspace. This is a big shift in terms of the policies of the Saudi government. Does that harbinger the possibility of Saudi Arabia entering into the Abrahamic Accords?
Yes, I think it does. It's not something that's going to happen immediately or even soon, but it's there. It's a prize there for the taking down the road. None of what has happened over the last 2 years, with Israel signing full peace treaties with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, Morocco, and other countries, none of this would have happened without a green light from Riyadh. None of the insanely swift, skyrocketing trade and defense agreements between Israel and the Gulf states would have been possible without Saudi assent and without hundreds of direct flights that already exist every month between Israel and Arabian Gulf states, all of which traverse Saudi airspace. Now the Saudis have gone one step further, and they'll be allowing Israeli airlines and international airlines to traverse Saudi airspace to and from other destinations, meaning that El Al, the Israeli national airline, can fly to India or China in a more direct route, directly over Saudi Arabia and the Gulf without having to skirt around the Arabian Peninsula. And that's one more modest Saudi concession to the new winds of peace that are blowing through this region. And let me just add, even though you didn't ask, I've now been to the Gulf states twice, both Dubai and Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates, and I was welcomed and embraced there as an Israeli and as a Jew with open arms. There is a discourse of true moderation and reconciliation that the leadership of that country is advancing. I think their desire for peace and full cultural trade and defense ties with Israel is substantive and deep. It goes much beyond a partnership against Iran. It is a reflection of a change in these countries, a desire on their part to advance a new concept of what it means to be an Arab and a Muslim in partnership with Israel and the Western world. And they even see Israel as a model. It's amazing. I discovered there they see Israel as a model society. They see Israel as a society that is both very nationalistic, very traditional, deep ethnic and community ties, a family-oriented society where religion plays an important part in national life, and at the same time a country that is modern, technological, advanced, and deeply tied to the Western world, and that's exactly what they want for themselves. That's the model of nationality and open to the openness to the globe, that they seek for themselves. So partnering with Israel is a function of a deeper change. I think it's good for the long term. And if Washington in particular plays its cards smartly, it can help advance this process and expand it to other countries in the region. Partnering with Iran, on the other hand, cutting a weak nuclear deal with Iran that allows the Iranians to keep their enrichment facilities and continue fomenting terrorism and violence across the region is not the right way to go. And I hope and pray the Biden administration wisens up in this regard.
Okay, David, thank you so much. We've kind of run out of time, but I want to thank you for joining us and sharing your insights. David Weinberg is a columnist with the Jerusalem Post and Israel Hayom, focusing on diplomatic and defense issues. He's also a principal at Aurora Strategy Global. He joins us today from Nove Scotia in Israel, and I want to thank him for his time. Thank you.